special welcome to some of the students in our midst from our leading secondary schools. They have a very special interest in tonight's subject, the 1763 Slave Uprising. For this is one of the special slave rebellions that the Caribbean Examinations Council requires the students to study with depth, both at the lower C-Sec level and at the higher Cape level. And so they have a very personal interest in this evening's presentation. We really want to welcome you, and we expect others to come.
So I want to invite all of you to come back tomorrow as we launch that book. We would also be doing a special exhibition at the National Museum where we'll focus, our focus will be in that exhibition about the 1763 revolt. And that exhibition, we were assisted in putting together that exhibition by Dr. Wagner from the Archives of the Netherlands. And he is here in Guyana, and he will tell us some more about that lecture. So we will be doing that on the 21st at the National Museum. After we launch it there and we host it at the museum for a couple of days, we'll then move it around the country so that other persons will be able to see the exhibition. And we're asking institutions who would like to host the exhibition to contact us so that we can take it to these institutions. In addition to that, we will also be launching an information center just behind the Coffee Monument, or the 1763 Monument, in the Square of the Revolution. So next week, we'll be also doing that. We have also contacted UNESCO, Paris, and during the year, we'll be hosting an exhibition on slavery. This exhibition was first put together in 2008 by the Liverpool Museum.
While studying at Bona campus, he was crowned sprint champion of Jamaica long before the advent of Usain Bolt. He also became London University and British University's 100 meters champion in the mid-1960s. And in his later life, he contributed significantly to the Barbados Track and Field Association. It is certainly no coincidence that he is the proud father of Barbadian Olympic medalist Berbice Thompson. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with a quote, and it goes like this. Professor Thompson's life is a model of service to his fellow man. While his academic life has been dedicated to researching the abomination of African slavery and servitude, with its many layers of cruelty, contradictions, and ambiguities, I take great pleasure in presenting to you a distinguished son of Guyana soil and a Caribbean leading light in Professor Emeritus, Professor Alvin Thompson, to make his presentation on the Berbice Slave Uprising of 1763. At this time, I also want to inform you of the presence of Mr. Thompson. Welcome.
This is why it is so important for us to have a good knowledge of people from where they came, their trials and tribulations, and how we have managed to build what we have built. And this is why I'm here today, because of my interest in this subject, and of course my interest in this country. So here I go. The Berbice Slave Uprising of 1763, that's the topic, historical and present-day significance. I begin with the introduction. The Berbice Slave Uprising of 1763 is by far the most important uprising of enslaved peoples in Guyana in terms of its scale and significance. It was the first uprising on record of enslaved peoples in the Americas, trying to overthrow slavery and arguably the colonial system, at least at one point in the course of events. In this respect, it preceded the much larger and far more well-known uprising among the enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or modern Haiti, between 1791 and 1804, which succeeded with the Berbice Uprising but failed. It is important to stress here that the uprising in Berbice was motivated by the same basic idea that has caused people everywhere, geographically and historically, to revolt against oppression. It is the desire for freedom, the desire to control their lives, free from the trammels and dictates of others. Indeed, this desire seems to be ingrained in everything living. While restricted freedom could and often does lead to anarchy, completely or almost completely restricted control inevitably leads to the reduction of human beings to things, at least in the eyes of those who exercise power over them. Inevitably, in such circumstances, the vast majority of such persons seek to liberate themselves in a wide variety of ways, not only by open revolt, but also by abscondment, suicide, homicide, and the like. Enslaved persons in Berbice attempted to liberate themselves by these and other methods, as was also the case with their enslaved brethren elsewhere in the region. An enslaved girl in Berbice expressed this elemental desire for freedom clearly when her enslaver asked her whether she wanted to be free. She replied, and I quote, "To be sure, master, everybody like free," unquote. It is therefore naive to place other factors, such as inadequate food, clothing, housing, medical facilities, and so on, as the main reasons for revolt. Undoubtedly, these were added and often immediate incentives to revolt, but they were rarely, if ever, the primary causes. This could be seen clearly from the fact that in every country in the New World, the day on which slavery was abolished was a time of euphoria for the liberated people. In many countries, as right here in Guyana, the event is still commemorated and celebrated annually with a great deal of fanfare. Material and social conditions promoting rebellion. The desire for freedom apart, in the case of Berbice as elsewhere, the material and social conditions under which the enslaved people labored exacerbated the situation. The conditions included those which we have mentioned above. The sources currently available to us do not speak to the exact quantities of food and clothing, hours of work, or kind of dwellings in which they lived. We glean from a few available Dutch sources that they were treated horribly. We glean, for instance, from the statement that Adrian Van Porkel, government secretary in the colony in 1670s, stated that this was the case. He said that they were given fish once or twice per year, and a cow or a horse that had died of itself. This was true also in several parts of the British West Indies, as we know from several other writers. It was not until the late 18th century that the colonial government in Berbice laid down specific laws about the quantity of food that enslaved peoples should receive. In practice, however, the laws were more frequently breached than honored and had to be renewed several times, prescribing more serious penalties against delinquents. In Berbice, as in other Caribbean colonies, enslaved people had to supplement their diets through their own efforts. Even so, these diets were notorious for lack of protein and essential vitamins. As regard accommodation, Van Berkel wrote prettily and pitifully, quote, "Their lodging is a hard board," unquote. Improvements in accommodation had much to do with their own initiative in building their homes. By the 19th century, at least in some instances, they had erected many small but less constricted dwellings. Still, much was left to be desired, since very often they did not have the time or resources to go into the forest to obtain materials that were needed and to pay for ancillary building services where necessary. Certainly, these were the most common venues in which brutalities took place. However, a careful look at the extant sources indicates that the worst brutalities on record occurred outside of the work environment, and I want to stress that. Confined against enslaved people did not have to do with what happened in the fields. Again, we have information on a few specific cases of brutality in the colony during the 18th century, and a whole lot more during the following century when government records on the subject were kept more systematically. We know that the enslaved people mentioned that one of the issues which triggered the uprising in 1763 was the brutal treatment that they received at the hands of the planters and overseers. They named 8 of their most notorious abusers and killed a few of those on whom they laid their hands during the uprising. We also know that Governor Simon van Hogenheim, who presided over the colony during and immediately after the uprising, wrote in 1764 that he saw an enslaved man who had been punished by using a saw on his back. The governor actually saw the man's skin hanging from his body. That is just a month or two after the putting down of the rebellion. He also wrote, just around that time, about a 7-year-old girl who had been guilty of indulging in, quote, only trifles and childishness, deserving only of a child's punishment, unquote, but whose manager had ordered her to be punished with 250 lashes and be placed in the stocks. She remained in that constricting position for 3 weeks without any food except what enslaved people had smuggled to her. The governor commented that by that time her body had been poorly thrown to pieces. The manager seemed disposed to punish her further, and it was only on the governor's insistence that he released her. But of course, the records do not state what happened after the governor left. The enslavers in Berbice continued such sadistic practices well into the British period, as the following very few examples must illustrate. In the early 19th century, Sinclair, a British soldier, witnessed the right hand of a sturdy young enslaved man being chopped off by judicial order for raising it threateningly against a white person. In 1817, a woman named America, who was 4 months pregnant, was accused of insolence. She was stripped naked, tied to 4 stakes with her belly on the ground, and I should point out what they did if a woman was pregnant was that they scooped out the earth from the ground to accommodate the protrusion. So she was pinned out, and she was given 150 lashes by 2 strong drivers. I should say here, in this instance, the matter went to court because of a missionary John Ray, and the person was sentenced to, I think, 4 months imprisonment, though he only actually served 2. The case of Rosa in 1825 was far more horrendous and troubling, and that is very close to the abolition of slavery. She testified that she was 5 months pregnant at the time that she was sent to pick coffee in the Loki or shed. Incidentally, African midwife thought that she must have been in a more advanced stage of pregnancy based on the overall development of the fetus. In any event, the task to which she was assigned usually involves stooping down. But in her circumstance, she was unable to do so and had to perform her job on her knees. She was unable to complete the job in time, and so the manager ordered the driver to whip her. Although the driver drew to his attention the advanced stage of her pregnancy, he did not relent. She was carried the following day. The African midwife had to force out the baby. According to the midwife, the child's arm was broken, one eye was out, the child was bruised and sunken in the head. The midwife testified it was a 5-year child. Quite formed in every respect, unquote. Then examined her on the following day, and according to Rosa, we attributed her miscarriage to the fact that she must have been eating green pines, which is what seemed to have been an abortifacient, allowing for abortion. Brutalities like those described above were endemic to Berbice Slave Society and indeed to Caribbean Slave Society. They led to unrest among the enslaved population. And in 1763, to the uprising of which this lecture is concerned. We will not spend much time on the wider circumstances that led to the uprising. And Cameron, better known as Anne Benjamin, in a recent work titled The Berbice Slave Uprising in 1763, has dealt in some detail with them, and so I shall mention the most important only briefly. The objective circumstances include the much larger ratio of blacks to white, 11 to 1 or greater, the relatively few estates over the vast colony, the lack of adequate force in other strongholds, the absence of a standing army, a small and large untrained militia, the extreme reluctance and even timidity of most Dutchmen in the colony, the prevalence of sickness, it is thought it was yellow fever, which had been afflicting mainly whites in the colony since 1755, and which seems to have reached epidemic proportions in the months just before the uprising. Several small uprisings which had taken place in the colony, notably in 1749, 1752, and 1762. Rumors of unrest or insurrection on a few estates high up the Berbice River, and at least 3 incidents of insubordination among the mercenary soldiers in the colony in the 1750s. Thus, the early 1760s were perhaps the most propitious time for an uprising. It is indicative of the revolutionary consciousness of the enslaved people that they struck a blow for freedom when the whites were most vulnerable. Origins and course of the uprising. Historians have sought to determine whether the 23rd or the 27th of February should be regarded as the start of the uprising in Berbice. If one takes the narrow view that Berbice, the word Berbice in this context, should be viewed specifically and narrowly as the Berbice River, then the obvious date would be the latter of the 27th. However, if the wider, and in my opinion, the more correct interpretation should be taken to refer to the uprising as that which took place in the colony as a whole, the seminal date should be the former, the 23rd. It is incontestable that the uprising at Magdalenenburg on the plantation, on the Magdalenenburg plantation on the Kanji or Kanye River, a tributary of the Berbice River, took place on that date. It is also incontestable that at the outset, It had nothing to do with what is happening on the Bay River. The revolt of the Kanji, which was much less organized than that which was to take place a few days later on the Berbice River, soon experienced many problems, forcing the insurgents to try to head toward the Corinthi River. However, troops from Suriname cut them off and quickly dealt a serious blow to the uprising. Nevertheless, it gained new life and lasted for several months after Coffee sent insurgents from his group to take command there. In spite of this circumstance, it is difficult to believe that what was happening in Kanji was completely unknown among the would-be insurgents on the Berbice River before the uprising on that river actually took place. One wonders, for instance, whether the fears that Van Guggenheim had burst as early as the 6th of March, that the insurgents on the two rivers would join forces, was based on information that he had received about what was happening on both fronts. More than this, as noted above, at the height of the revolt, insurgents from the larger river not only made contact with insurgents on the smaller one, but also sent leaders to take command of various revolutionary posts that had been set up there. We know also that a group of the Suriname mercenary soldiers who had been dispatched to put down the Kanji uprising defected, eventually made their way into the Berbice area, and some of them played an important role in repairing the firearms and perhaps giving logistical advice to the insurgents. What we do not know for sure is whether any of the Kanji insurgents made contact with their brethren in Berbice at the outset of their revolt. Even so, it is perhaps unnecessary to try to draw any rigid separation between the two sets of events. Dealing more directly with the uprising on the Berbice River, the evidence suggests that the revolt was already being planned by the insurgents at some non-specific time before the events on the Kanji River. Indeed, it appears to have achieved a high level of organization with Coffee as their main leader. The leaders managed to maintain great secrecy in doing so, and the whites were caught completely off guard when the uprising actually commenced. However, it still remains a matter of speculation as to whether the insurgents intended to expel the enslavers from the colony by force or by a negotiated settlement or agreement. At the outset of the uprising, and indeed for several weeks thereafter, the insurgents made no concerted appeal to arms as the arbiter of the conflict, though they killed a few whites who sought to free the middle reaches of the colony and took others as prisoners. They also raided the plantations for weapons, took control of several plantations, and the dilapidated fort was saw the only fort in the colony, located some distance upriver, and sent letters to Van Guggenheim stating that they had revolted, why they had revolted, and that they intended to take over the entire colony. Allowing the insurgents to remain in control of the former while the enslavers stayed in command of the latter. Coffee was prepared to trade with the whites on an amicable basis, if that was at all possible. A great rift took place in the latter part of the revolt between Coffee and some of the other leaders, and especially between him and Atta, the deputy, over the issue of negotiations rather than the use of force to drive out the whites from the colony. Eventually, Coffee lost control of the leadership to Atta, committed suicide, but not before burying a small quantity of gunpowder at a still unknown location. Creoles, or Berbice-born enslaved persons, who formed an important cohort during the early phases of the conspiracy, came to loggerheads with the new leadership who wanted to reduce them to subalterns and even drawers of wood and drawers of water. Various ethnic groups from modern Congo, Angola, and Ghana fell out with each other and soon formed separate groups, each at loggerheads with the other. Critical shortages of weapons, and especially of gunpowder, and also of food, appealed to the insurgents, forcing them to forage in their journey adjoining forests and also to slay nearly all the livestock and even their horses to survive. The indigenous people who were never really a part of the activities at first became disaffected by the treatment that some insurgents meted out to them and allied with the whites on being given firearms and bounty to hold the ring against the insurgents in the upper river area, and later to attack the hideouts of the would-be Maroons after the insurgents began to flee into the deeper recesses of the forests which surrounded Olivia on the plantation. Quite apart from these circumstances, Van Hoegenheim was able to use the relatively long period of negotiation, which was checkered by only very minor physical engagements, to send for and await military and other supplies from Europe. He was able to commandeer commercial vessels that lay in the river at the time, and received further assistance from such places as St. Eustatius and Suriname, while the Emirati held the ring against those who attempted to form a link with that region or to retreat there. The indigenous peoples and the small force from Barbados, at the solicitation of Geddy Clark, a Barbados plant in the Emirati, helped to hold the ring there. All these events did not take place at the same time, but by the end of March, the tide had begun to turn in favor of the whites. Nevertheless, Van Hoegenheim continued to maintain the facade of a negotiated settlement until a very substantial force could be assembled against the insurgents. Skirmishes resumed in early April, and a major assault by insurgents took place in mid-May in an abortive attempt to seize one of the vessels sent from St. Eustatius. The next 5 months or so were marked by petty skirmishes between the two parties until the governor felt that the insurgents were sufficiently devastated and white reinforcements were large enough to offer counter-assault. Eventually, the States General sent out about 1,000 troops in 2 expeditions. Not all was lost for the insurgents in respect of maintaining control of any of the settled areas within the colony. Most of the organized groups opted for guerrilla warfare, moving higher upriver and into remote forest terrain. However, the troops, aided by Africans who had never revolted, indigenous peoples, and several insurgents who now gravitated to the whites in order to save their necks, too proved to be a source that could not be contained in the long term. By March or April 1764, the insurgency was all but over, with the betrayal and capture of Atta, who was executed in a most horrible way. In all, 124 persons were executed after sentence by a special court set up to try them. Van Hoegenheim tried in vain for some time to limit the number of executions, but eventually the bloodletting stopped. Many other enslaved persons who had returned to their enslavers experienced brutal treatment just short of death because they were deemed important to the rehabilitation of the colony. Still, the colony had suffered badly during the insurgency. This was evident from the substantial drop in the population. Never a large one demographically, the white population declined from 286 in 1763 to 116 in 1764, while the black population declined from 3,833 to 2,464 during the same period. Several whites had made it safely to some other colony or to Europe, while blacks who did not die seemed to have formed small and medium-sized Maroon communities in the deep hinterland, some apparently linking up with Maroons in the plantation settlement of Tamararo. Many estates were destroyed in both rivers, several of them never to be rehabilitated. Capital was badly lacking to rehabilitate the estates, and for well over a decade, the colony enjoyed the notoriety of a habitat for insurgents, not to mention a white man's blade. The division was so palpable to Governor Van Hoegenheim that he was able to factor it into his strategy to launch a counter-offensive against the insurgents at a critical stage in the conflict. If it is true that Coffee not only committed suicide, but also buried a small amount of gunpowder and possibly some of the arms that were at his disposal and the disposal of the insurgents, it says quite a lot about the extent of the divisions which prevailed in the revolutionary camp at the precise time that they needed to be most united. Also the fact that Akara and Usari, two of the principal leaders in the early stages of the uprising, later became allies of the oppressors and actually participated in bringing several of the insurgents to heel, including Atta, who had ensconced himself in a maroon settlement and was engaging in the soldiery combat, speaks volumes about the nature and significance of the splinter that took place in the last stages of the uprising. My statement above does not mean, should not be taken to mean, that I'm suggesting that ethnicity should be the main form of reference in human society. I will show above the deleterious effects of such a situation on the body politic. In any modern society, the national grade should be far more important than the ethnic one. The good of the state as a whole should subsume and sublimate all other considerations. The last major consideration in respect of the Berbice Uprising is how we should objectify it in our national consciousness. That is why I believe you're here, and certainly that is why I'm here as a lioness. In doing so, we need to bear in mind that throughout the Americas, governments and private organizations are finding ways to honor enslaved persons who rebelled against the slavery system and often gave their lives to free themselves and their brethren. Among these are Zumbi of Palmares in Brazil, Gaspar Yanga in Mexico, Sebastian Lemba in the Dominican Republic, La Mulatra Solitude and Louis Del Rez in Guadeloupe, Tula in Curaçao, Sojourner Truth in the United States, Prince Class in Antigua, Buster in Barbados, Pompey in the Bahamas, Sam Sharp and Brandy Nanny of Jamaica, Sally Bassett in Little Bermuda, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. The last country also erected a statue to the Black Maroon, arguably the most iconic figure to enslaved people anywhere in the world. The list of honorees is much larger, much longer. The United States is also raising funds as we speak to build a monument to the memory of the enslaved peoples in the Americas and elsewhere. It is in this wider context that we must view the 1763 monument, or the coffee statue as it is usually called, which was erected in 1976. However, before dealing with this monument, we need to say a bit about the way or ways in which the regime of President Forrest Burnham sought to make political and social capital out of the uprising. In 1970, he sought to make it the ideological tool of government. As part of his new approach, he gave precedence to the date on which the uprising commenced, 23rd of February, rather than that on which the country achieved its independence, 26th of May. National celebrations formally taking place on the latter date were redirected to the earlier one. He and his courts, who supported this move, sought to invest the uprising. The statue or main part of the monument depicts an individual who does not really represent an enslaved person. And most persons would probably agree that it does not portray an image of any living being. It is a highly imaginative work which seems to depict forms of deities that are widely represented in African, Asian, and Native American art. Perhaps that is exactly how Philip Moore, the sculptor, intended it to appear. Attached to this anthropomorphic image, perhaps the best term to employ for the statue, are representations of animals, while the body itself is incised with representations of human faces. In an interpretive essay, archaeologist and anthropologist Dennis Williams
submitted that the sculptor showed a deliberate disregard of the natural proportions of the human figure, and in true African fashion, focused on immateriality and spirituality, on the psychic and organic truth of 1763. In this sense, he asserts, the statue is, quote, mythological and ideal, not naturalistic. He identified the faces around the statue's body as those of Coffey's co-revolutionaries, and declared that the sculptor initiated a, quote, revolution of vision, quote, that requires the spectators to undergo a similar revolution in order to understand the work. More revolutionary, perhaps, in Williams's interpretation, it is viewed that by breaking out of European artistic conventions, and to some extent even those of Africa and Asia, the sculptor attempted to get Guyanese to break away from the old conventions of the past associated with slavery and colonialism, to be, quote, freed from the self-doubt and self-contempt implanted in our people during the 19th, probably 18th century. I'll be soon finished. Both the 1763 monument and the role of Coffey have come in for serious criticism by some sections of the Guyanese population. Many persons consider that the monument expressive of a national personality, or what we may call, quote, the soul of a nation, should reflect some consensus on what it should be like. In other words, the public should be consulted in some way before action is taken. Failure to do so has resulted in great division in several countries, including some Caribbean ones. This is true, for instance, I'll just give a few examples, of the statue of the mighty sparrow in Trinidad in 2001. It is even more so the first statue erected to Bob Marley in Jamaica in 1983, which was pelted with stones and fruit after some unveiling had to be moved from the open public space into the museum. The second one now there. And of the highly controversial statue called Redemption Song in Emancipation Park in the heart of Kingston, erected in 2003. How many of you have seen that statue? You must go and see it if you have not. The statue depicts two starkly naked black persons, starkly naked, oversized, larger than life beings, 8 feet or more tall, with their genital explicitly exposed and telling these boyfriends, and just emerging from the pool. This statue has been deemed to be so risky that I think it was, what's the other one? Actually, what's the other one? Apart from their appearance, public approaches to the few monuments in the Caribbean have been quite varied for a number of reasons. First, the people have not generally been taught to appreciate the significance of monuments in the same way as, for example, Europeans. Thus, there is generally a striking indifference to the issue of monuments, and this attitude often pervades even the highest echelons of our society. For instance, our leaders in government, many of whom seem not to recognize the urgency or even necessity of erecting monuments to the victims of colonialism. Second, and partly as a result of the forest observation, people often do not see the need to invest what they view as scarce financial resources in the erection of a structure that is viewed as being more symbolic than functional. And the leaders appear at times to be afraid that the public will criticize them for wasting such resources rather than spending them on roads, buildings, transport, health, and so on. In the context of Guyana, the situation is compounded by the fact that especially since the late 1960s, and certainly by the late 1950s, and certainly by the early 1960s, The two main ethnic groups have been jostling with each other for political, social, and cultural precedence. Clearly, this has acted as a constraint in identifying and honoring historical and present-day national personalities in the ways in which they deserve. Although in the case of coffee, the leaders of the People's Progressive Party and the People's National Congress agreed to acclaim him as the nation's first national hero. As far as I'm aware, the nation's only national hero. Am I correct? While some Guyanese question his elevation to national hero status because of his procrastination in waging an all-out war against the enslavers and his action in burying the gunpowder immediately prior to his suicide, we must realize that Atta and other insurgents accorded him full honors at his burial. To quote Benjamin Cameron, writing in 2007, despite this, the revolutionaries honored him with the burial of a great chief and killed two whites on his grave, and not justifying the killing of any personal human sacrifice, but it was part of the African way of honoring great persons even in Africa killing people. She goes as far as to state that, quote, this is in 2007, the book that is going to be launched officially tomorrow. The 1763 Uprising still stands as one of the most remarkable events of Western history, and Governor Coffee as one of the region's most outstanding leaders. In 1988, Dr. Chelly Jagan and Moses Nakamatu produced a statement on the 250th anniversary of emancipation, in which they declared that, quote, in the face of great odds, superior forces in arms, our early revolutionaries proved they could not easily be intimidated. Leaders such as Coffee in Berbice, Pamina in Demerara, and Damon in Essequibo, they done their lives in the world struggles for freedom, unquote. In 2002, President Bara Jagyo is reported to have stated, quote, Guyana holds the honor in the history of this hemisphere of holding the first successful slave rebellion which overthrew the Dutch and the insurgents were in control of Berbice for over a year before it was brutally and ruthlessly smashed, unquote. Without debating the accuracy of some of these statements, I have cited them to indicate that it is possible that for our leaders to span the historical and ethnic divides that have existed for some time over the question of our national heroes. As I've intimated above, it is not only those who have struggled against slavery who deserve to be honored in visual and other ways by the nation, regardless of their ethnic or ideological stance. We should welcome the images to trade unionists Hubert Critchlow and President Forrest Barnum. I consider it imperative to honor President Dr. Chelly Jacob, Richard Ishmael, and though he's in this audience and may in fact disagree with me, Sir Sridhar Ramphal, in statuary form in very prominent places in the capital city. An airport and a building to honor Dr. Jagan is fine, but they do not tell the story of his struggles to achieve freedom and promote progress, dignity among the Guyanese people, in the way at least in which it ought to be told. The importance of statues is that they stand in your face. They will not move, you have to move. You simply cannot ignore them. And because of this circumstance, both locals and foreigners have to recognize their existence and often to ask questions about the contribution that these personalities depicted in the statues have made to the nation. But it is not only important to erect them, we need to maintain them in good repair. The sad reality is that a number of the statues to nationalist leaders in the region are being neglected.
Informative, stimulating, and I'm sure controversial and so on. But one of my colleagues in the high table say, well, this is what academic freedom is all about. You go back to Barbados, we got a face to fire here. If you have a program, you will see that we should have at this time some remarks by Emeritus. Emeritus is the project of the country. And what Eric was asked to do is to summarize very concisely, very succinctly, some of the issues in the lecture to enable us to ask meaningful questions and to make meaningful comments. So these lectures are wide ranging. They cover a whole series of matters. Those who were following the lecture began by drawing attention to something that many people ignore, that one needs to consider the fundamental causes of rebellions as the basic human desire for freedom, not necessarily the material and the social factors that may seem to propel people to rebellion. And he talked a lot about the physical brutality. I'm sure he was struck by the emotional impact as he talked about the story of Rosa, about people who got into study of slavery as deep as Alvin has. Those things are not simply academic. They can hit you right into the core. It must have been the first time I've seen any lecture on slavery, somebody so emotionally disturbed. We talked a lot about that. We talked about the origins of the course of the rebellion, dealing with the whole issue about the dating, the 23rd, 27th. Is there any link between the two rebellions? If so, what link? Those are controversial things. I'm sure that they might interest some of you, might evoke some. We talked about different factors that led to the collapse of the rebellion, the delay in the long attempt to negotiate a settlement. Talked about the critical shortage of weapons. Drew attention to a number of the considerations cited the work of Van Benjamin. The second part of the lecture, where he began by talking about historical significance in the impact of the rebellion, the economy of the country, the impact of the demography, and so on. Then spent a significant amount of time on the present day significance. I don't think many of us did not expect so much time spent. He talked about people should be treated as human beings with innate liberal rights. Talked about violence and revolutionary violence and people's response to oppression. Talked in the Guyana context and further field about ethnic divisions, citing polarization as dangerous. We went on to talk about how we should put these important events that to some are divisive should be seen in national consciousness. And he began to talk about the way they, one in particular in the 70s, late 60s, how he linked the 1763 Uprising to modern developments in Guyanese history. We went on to talk about the erection of monuments, maintaining them, people's popular response to them, and talk about the inadequate attention being paid to the buildings of our nation, not being under sufficiently. So we covered the whole range of issues in terms of the modern significance, much more than we did in terms of the historical significance around the 1760s. I think at this time we would have a bit of interaction. That's just to remind you of some of the issues. I'm going to ask two things. One, we invite both questions and comments, and obviously we would like them to be as concise, the comments as concise, and the questions as precise as possible. But we would like you first of all to stand and give us a name, and then make a comment or pose a question.
Which is got from the evaporation of salt water. And there's a lot of salt being manufactured in West Africa at the time. And why was a lot of that manufactured? I didn't pose it last minute. But I would like to hear a bit more about arms. Blood River. There's a South African battle when Shackleton was fighting. The Gatling gun proved superior, and it was the Gatling gun that turned the tables in that particular struggle. In the Second World War, I don't think the Americans were better than the Japanese, but they had an atomic bomb. They closed them down. So in that sense, and on the other hand, I was thinking also of morale, the use of morale in the struggle. And two examples came to mind as we spoke. One was in the case of Ethiopia when they were fighting the Italians. It was morale that the Ethiopians had that made them defeat the Italians. And Russia was celebrating the Battle of Stalingrad. And again, what Stalin used was basically morale against the Germans that turned the tide in the Second World War. And those were still a little bit of the reflections I made while you were speaking.
Thank you for your comments and questions. The issue of the importance of weapons, kinds of weapons, and how Maroons, black insurgents manage them in the struggle remains a bit controversial because we don't get all the information. But if you study, for instance, Maroons from the Caribbean, you will realize that they were at a decisive disadvantage in terms of weaponry, but they won many battles through strategies they employed and so forth. And if you want, for instance, to read an account of Maroon's strategy in Suriname, you can go to John Stedman's book, Narrative of a 5 Years Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname, 1772-1779. This was a mercenary soldier, trained army captain. He commended them for the way they used their weapons, similarly in Jamaica, forcing treaties and so on. I'm saying all that to say that weaponry is an important component, but it is not decisive. And it certainly was not at that time. What we know is that because the whites did not expect it, the insurgents collected a fair amount of weapons and gunpowder from the estates. Each estate kept a certain amount of gunpowder, firearms for defensive purposes, especially since they were isolated, and also all white males between the ages of I think 16 and 60 had to turn out for drills, theoretically at least, keep good fire and so forth and so on. So we know that they seized those weapons. We don't know how they managed to keep them in repair. We know there were African blacksmiths who repaired weapons. And Benjamin has surmised that they repaired their weapons, made their weapons. I don't think that they made weapons. That technology was quite advanced even for Africans in the 19th century. But the critical thing is this. Within 2 weeks, had the blacks continued the fight against the whites, they would have been driven out of the country because Van Hugenheim and his followers and the whites found themselves at Post St. Andrews at the mouth of the river, which was a redoubt. It wasn't a fort. And they were like sitting ducks. And it has remained a problem for historians to understand why Coffee never carried the fight to the coast, and it's thought that that was where the confusion was between people like Atta and others who wanted to carry the struggle. Now, would the struggle have ultimately led to the holding of the country? Certainly they could have taken the country. There's no doubt about this. Could they hold it? We don't know. The Haitian fighters did in revolutionary times. Europe had just come out of a 7 years war. Holland was not as strong. We don't know whether Holland would have wanted to invest time and money on a large scale in a quality that was of minimal profitability.